All right, we're to our last session of the day. Would like to introduce Randy Welsh. He's the head of the National Wild and Scenic River Program for the U.S. Forest Service. And with him today will be Adam Milner, and he was with the Bureau of Land Management.
Well, welcome. I want to thank everybody for sticking around this afternoon. It's kind of hard to be the last group for the day, but we'll try to make it somewhat interesting for you. So how many of you have had some sense of carrying capacity in the past? All right, so good. We'll stage that. Before I get ahead of myself, I would like to introduce myself. I'm Randy Welsh. I'm the National Program Lead for Wild and Scenic Rivers for the Forest Service, and I also serve as the chair for the Interagency Wild and Scenic River Coordinating Council, which is made up of the four land management agencies that manage wild and scenic rivers for the federal government. And with me today is Adam Milner, who is from the Salem office of the BLM. Now, originally your program said Molly Chaudé from the Forest Service was going to present this, and Molly retired on me at the beginning of the year. So Kathy Bailey, who is the national lead for the Wild and Scenic River program for the BLM, was going to pitch hit and be here, but she got sequestered, so she couldn't make the trip, and so Adam graciously agreed to step in for Kathy, and Adam is our newest member of the Interagency Wild and Scenic River Coordinating Council as a field representative for the BLM. So everybody, thank Adam right now for participating today.
Yeah, my name's Adam Milner. I'm an outdoor recreation planner with the BLM. I live in Portland, work for the Salem District. Also want to highlight that Heath Emmons, out of the Glen Allen Field Office up in Alaska, helped contribute to this. So I'm just kind of stepping in for him and Kathy and all the other folks that couldn't be here. So.
All right, thanks, Adam. So if you think about carrying capacity, I think most people think about it in terms of sort of physical capacity. There's a sign over on the wall that says 1,226 people can fill this room. Somehow I think it means with the wall down, the whole ballroom could probably hold 1,200 people. So think about it as this room holding 600 people. But that's a fire department physical capacity for a movement, getting access out, whatever. If you were going to hold a cocktail party in here, maybe you would be comfortable with having 500 people. If you were going to have a theater set up and watch a movie, just did a quick calculation of these seats, you could probably put 400 seats in here pretty comfortable before people started to fidget, or you wouldn't be able to put more than 400 seats in. But if you really wanted to have like a small group discussion or a meeting of some sort, you might be down to 20 or 30 seats or people in a room. And really, if you thought about it, you could probably put 5,000 bodies in this room if you filled it fully to capacity. But why would you want to do that? So really the point is capacity really varies depending on what you want to do. And we really don't want to talk about carrying capacity per se. It's an old definition for a concept. What we want to talk about is user capacity. So what our intent for this next 30 minutes is to talk about a paper that the Interagency Wild and Scenic Rivers Coordinating Council has been preparing that will identify how to define carrying user capacities for wild and scenic rivers. Why you would want to do that, the basis for it in law, and then how to go about doing it. So this presentation really is to establish that legal requirement and then describe how we use user capacity in the context of wild and scenic river management in our Wild and Scenic River Management Comprehensive Resource Management Plans. And then we want to share with you a 10-step process that's been developed that will walk people through the process of identifying user capacities for wild and scenic rivers. And it's not a recipe and it's not a how-to. We want to just explain what those 10 steps are as we go through this discussion. And then finally show the relationship of carrying user capacities to NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act, environmental analysis that each of us as federal land management agencies are obligated to perform, and then explain the context of our Wild and Scenic River Coordinating Council paper that is the basis for this talk and what our next steps are for getting more feedback about it. So in the context that we're going to talk about today, visitor use management is a pretty big field. And the federal agencies have identified and established a visitor use management council that's to help the agencies figure out how to handle common visitor use management issues. Well, one of the issues that they've identified early on is how do the agencies address visitor use capacities in a general sense. And in our case, we're looking at a smaller subset of that, is how to address Wild and Scenic River user capacities, which are a somewhat different beast than a regular visitor use capacity. So a few definitions. Visitor capacity, as defined by the Visitor Use Management Council, says that it's the maximum amount and the type of visitor use that an area can accommodate while sustaining desired resource conditions and visitor experiences consistent with the values for which the area was established. Now, early on, the Interagency Wild and Scenic River Coordinating Council, back in the early 80s, codified a definition of carrying capacity, which says it was the quantity of recreation use an area can sustain without adverse impact on the outstanding remarkable values and the free-flowing character of the area. Now, that was back in 1982. And again, it was thinking more about the carrying capacity concept of a physical limit of some sort. We now have turned around and are following with the Visitor Use Management Council and using a more updated term for user capacity that in the context of Wild and Scenic Rivers is that the actual level of visitor use that will not adversely impact river values or other desired conditions. And in this case, river values in a specific Wild and Scenic River context refer to free flow, water quality, and the ORVs, which are the threefold purposes for Wild and Scenic Rivers. So what we have done is we've created a paper. How many of you ever been to the rivers.gov website? So a few, but not very many of you. So on the rivers.gov website, there is a comprehensive list of technical papers that have been produced by the Interagency Coordinating Council that cover a variety of topics that deal with the management of wild and scenic rivers. The whole gamut from management, designation, study, boundaries, implementing comprehensive resource management plans, you name it, it's probably there already. But this was one paper that we didn't have, and that was how to address user capacity. So it is being worked on right now. In addition, there was a new paper that we produced in 2010 that talked about, for newly designated wild and scenic rivers, what are the interim managements and the steps to develop a comprehensive river management plan. This current paper is meant to complement that paper to help people understand how to apply user capacities when they're developing their comprehensive resource management plans. So why do we worry about user capacities? Well, in a Wild and Scenic River context, the Wild and Scenic River Act in section 3D1 makes it very clear that the plan shall address resource protection, development of lands and facilities, user capacities, and other management practices necessary or desirable to achieve the purposes of the Act. So for us, it's a requirement by Congress that we include user capacity in our CRMPs. And this was made even clearer in a recent court ruling back in 2008 by the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, where the Park Service lost a lawsuit on their Merced Comprehensive Resource Management Plan. And as part of that ruling, the judge made it very clear that the Park Service should deal with and discuss the maximum number of people that can be received within the Wild and Scenic River corridor, and that he went on to say that CRMPs need to include specific measurable limits on use by use types, by activity types, and that these use levels have to be set so that they do not adversely affect the river values. Again, those threefold values of free flow, water quality, and ORVs. Several other things that came out of that lawsuit is that those limits need to be specific, measurable limits based on the use, that the CRMP needs to discuss that maximum number of people in the corridor, which really means if you've got activity A, activity B, activity C, activity D, all the way up to activity Z, you've got to figure out what the use limits associated with each of those activities would be to sum up to some maximum limit. And it's not a linear equation, it's more of an algebraic programming function to figure out that polygon of activities and uses that will stay within the level that will protect your river values for each of those different activities. So the amounts of use need to be linked to the current uses in the river, to the facilities and how those facilities affect ORVs and those uses. That use levels may not necessarily rely on current uses, but you have to think about future uses or changes to use over time. And that your CRMP needs to include proactive measures, responses that you plan to take to keep you within the level or the limit that you establish, as well as the monitoring necessary to ensure that you are meeting your obligation to protect those values. So that CRMPs in this context would use this capacity framework to protect and enhance river values, and that you're going to use whatever capacities you come up with and the decisions for how you come up with those capacities to protect those values. That one of the key components of a wild and scenic river is its classification, wild, scenic, or recreational, based on the development level that the area had at the time of designation. That classification level also sort of creates a limit. It creates somewhat of a physical capacity, a social capacity, as to the types of activities that can be considered. Because one of the key tenets is that we do not change the classification of a wild and scenic river over time. So that would limit the types of activities that could occur. Wild river segments wouldn't have activities that would change or modify the landscape to any great material effect. Scenic sections, you wouldn't have activities that would, recreation activities that would propose changes to the shorelines or add additional access points to make it easier for people to perform some sort of recreation activity. So you have to think within the context of the classification as you look at your user capacities. So it's also important that you look at the scale, because the scale of the proposed activities, how much of the area they use, whether they're limited in context or very narrow in focus, and that CRMPs need to have some amount of flexibility associated with them so that you can adjust and you can take action over time. And they need to include the criteria that you're using and then the actual numbers. And I think that a lot of us struggle with that use of actual numbers. We don't like to think about putting an actual number out there because that then forces us to act upon it when we get to the point of exceeding that number or get close to exceeding that number. But that's what the judge told us we needed to do, is to set actual numbers. All right, so we've talked about this 10-step process, and I'm going to turn it over to Adam, who's going to walk us through the 10 steps of a wild and scenic river user capacity analysis.
All right, like Randy said, this is kind of a big deal for the land management agencies, especially if you work on a wild and scenic river. And I think you hit on it there at the end, is that, you know, we don't like to use numbers. We're river people. We don't want to count past 5, sometimes not past 3. So it's a situation where for a long time, as the land management agencies on these WSRs have been relying on narratives and descriptions of values and other things, and the ruling on the Merced really brought to our attention that when you put that in front of the court, they say, okay, that's great. We appreciate that you want to protect and enhance river values. We appreciate that you have a sense of that there's trade-offs here and that you're going to take the appropriate actions. You're going to take the necessary actions. Well, you know, unfortunately, in reality, that requires a number, and that requires a number that we have to set. And so this is a process, and like Randy said, that makes a lot of people nervous, especially if, in many of these cases, if not the majority, we're already probably past a number that is really comfortable for all parties involved or for protecting river values. So you have to think of this process, and I think that, you know, a lot of folks here are not necessarily ever going to have to write one of these plans, but I think these concepts are interesting and illustrative for us to work through some of the tough things as we have to do more of this. We're going to have to make more use allocation decisions. We're going to have a little more heavy-handed management on rivers as we move forward, and we have more people out there. So I know that everyone here, you know, might not necessarily have to do this, but I encourage you to kind of stick with me here and walk through this process, because I think the folks on the council have done a really good job of tackling something here that's pretty thorny, and it's going to be a big deal in the next few planning cycles and as new rivers are designated. So I want to highlight about the 10 steps, and we'll go through them, but this is not a one after the other type process. This is 10 steps. It's not a standalone document. This isn't like an appendix to your plan or something outside of NEPA. This is really a tool for us as river managers to work through to ensure that we have our bases covered in a logical way, in an ordered way, so that we can make sure that when we do get around to setting that difficult number, we have justification. Funny word, right? Justification for that. Everyone should be scared of arbitrary and capricious. Those are two not good words. So what we're talking about here is working us through this process and arriving at logical conclusions. So the first step, as with any planning effort, and a lot of this is stuff that prior to this whole user capacity issue even got brought up, are things that we should have been doing and things that you're going to do anytime that you engage in a plan of any type. So a lot of this will sound familiar if you have any kind of a planning background whatsoever. So first step, describe your free flow and ORVs. Like Randy said, it's the point of the Wild and Scenic River Act. It's our obligation, and it's what we're managing for, and we'll talk about that. Identify the desired conditions. We can all recognize a problem. Planning requires some forward thinking, identifying what you would like that situation to be. 3, establish management standards. This is where the numbers start. Oh boy. 4, identify kinds of use. This is the fun part. We'll get to that. 5, identify an amount of use. There it is, amount numbers again. We're really drilling down into this by this point, by area, by type. We're going to link that use, the type of use, the amount of use, and we're going to actually link it spatially to a river corridor where that's occurring and what facilities are being used. We're going to, number 7 is the big kahuna, estimate maximum numbers. That's kind of the crux of this whole thing. And then really 8 through 10 are a little bit somewhat downhill from there in terms of identifying what actions you would take if you have a problem. Hopefully we'll identify actions that we can take before we have a problem. That's a novel concept. And then, of course, the M word, monitoring. So step 1, river values. So if you're not familiar with the Wild and Scenic River Act, which not that many people are, it's a pretty complex policy framework, but describing river values, that involves your free-flowing characteristics, your water quality, and then any of those ORVs, outstandingly remarkable values. That's outstandingly remarkable. That must be pretty good.